a little, there we go, we've got our recording going on. So you should have had a permission button to test. Steve, if we could move on to the next slide, please. We're going to try a little exercise just to help us begin to think about the theme for this evening. So the next slide would be fab. So hopefully, while we're waiting for that to come up.
It would be fab.
Is it frozen?
Hold on a second.
Oh, the tech loves to do this, doesn't it? And we've got lots of things open. Just while we're waiting for the PowerPoint to cooperate. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. I'm going to invite you, if you are able, at the bottom of, well, hopefully at the bottom of your screen, or if you're working on a tablet, sometimes you access these by clicking the 3 little dots in the corner of your screen. You should be able to see a range of reaction buttons or emojis. And we want you to think about how well would you say you know your community. So we're thinking particularly about how we respond to community in our local community. You can choose whether that's where you live or whether you go to church if you travel a bit of a distance to go to church. So if you would say that you think you know your community really well, maybe it's somewhere you've lived for years, you're really involved, I'm going to invite you to press the heart emoji. If you think, well, I know it a little bit, but actually I'd like to know a little bit more. I sometimes feel a bit disconnected. Life has been busy, or I've just recently moved here, the thumbs up. And if actually, and this is the point where there's no shame in this is just about being honest, we think there'll be a range of reactions. Maybe you feel that the shocked face works well. You don't know the community very well. Maybe it's even a little bit daunting to think about getting to know your community well. Maybe it's somewhere that you don't particularly feel you belong or don't particularly feel safe in, or it's unfamiliar. So let's, we can stop sharing and hopefully see that range of reactions. So a heart for really well, a thumbs up for quite well, but I'd like to know more, a shocked face for it's a bit daunting. Steve, if we're able to stop sharing, let's see, and I'll pick one. I'm going to put a shocked face because I moved to my new appointment at the start of lockdown. I don't know my community in Lichfield very well at all. And I don't really know where to start because I've never lived anywhere like this before. It's a new build housing estate. It's new to me. So I'm seeing a real range of reactions here. Lots of thumbs up, people being really honest and say, I know the community a bit, but not very well. There are things I'd like to discover. I spotted a few hearts, not seeing so many shocked faces, and that's fine, but actually that's the truth for some people for lots of different reasons. Community is difficult. So we're going to continue to think about those themes, and I'm going to invite Hannah to lead us in opening prayer.
Brilliant. So we're just going to hold a moment of silence and then share a prayer as we begin this evening. So just take a moment of quiet. We just bring to mind whatever has been in our day this evening, whatever has gone before, and the things that are filling our mind, we hold them out to God this evening. And just pray that we will be able to leave them with God for the moment and bring ourselves to the conversation before us. And we pray. Creator God, teach us how to foster our own gifts and support others in the development of their gifts. In Jesus' name, Amen. So as you may have picked up if you've been at our other Life on the Breadline sessions, we're kind of jumping around the Life on the Breadline Lent Course. I think we've already had session 4 and we're looking at different places each week, but this week we are looking at session 4 of the Life on the Breadline course. If this is your first time joining one of these sessions, just a quick reminder of what the context is. So we are using Lent material that's been produced by the Life on the Breadline project. And the project was set up by Coventry University to understand how austerity has affected Christian engagement with poverty in the UK and in particular the theological motivations which underpin it. And they've worked with communities across the UK, with church leaders and with experts by experience, to think about what that context is in terms of how the church is responding to poverty today. And this evening's session is inspired by the particular research that the Life on the Breadline team did with Hodge Hill Church on the Firs and Bromford estate in Birmingham. Some of you might be familiar with that part of the world, and we'll have a little hear from some people from the community in a bit. Statistically, the Firs and Bromford estate in Birmingham is in the top 10% of deprived areas in England. On the estate, Hodge Hill Church and other partner organisations work together through an approach called asset-based community development, or ABCD, if you've heard of it with the abbreviation. And ABCD focuses on the gifts and assets in the neighbourhood level, rather than the deficits to start with. They're thinking about starting from what is strong and then moving on to address what is wrong. So in this session, we're going to think a little bit about that approach, perhaps what's different in that approach than other responses to poverty that we might experience either in the church or elsewhere. And we're going to explore particularly how giving attention to people's gifts can change the way, particularly as Christians, we respond to poverty. So to kick us off, we're going to hear from some of the people in that community, and we're going to watch a video where the Reverend Al Barrett from Hodge Hill reflects on the experience of the community in developing this approach. And as you watch, we'd like you to consider a question. And after we've watched the video, we're going to go into smaller groups and talk about our responses to that question. But we wanted to tell you it before the video so that you could hold it in your mind as you were listening to Al. So the question is, what is different about the work of Hodge Hill Church on the Firs and Bromford estate compared to responses to poverty, such as a food bank? So what is it that's different, that's standing out? And Kerry's put that in the chat there as well. So after we've watched the video, we'll come back to this question in smaller discussion groups. So I will bring the video up now.
And says hello everybody. So I have been the vicar of Hodge Hill for the last 11 years. Hodge Hill is a Church of England parish on the east edge of the city of Birmingham. We're a parish of about 20,000 people, and a good third of that parish is the Firs and Bromford estate. Firs and Bromford was built in the 1950s and 60s. Tower blocks, terraces, masonettes, largely rehousing people who had lived in inner city Birmingham, in the Aston area, in what were called back-to-backs at the time. And originally it was one of those kind of ideal garden city outer estates with loads of space for people to spread out, and what they called at the time the kind of villages in the sky, the tower blocks, which were meant to be kind of wonderful centres of community. As we all know, some of those buildings were not quite as wonderful as people thought at the time, and over the years that have followed, it's been a place where, certainly if you measure it in terms of indices of multiple deprivation, one of the stories that could be told about our estate is that most of it is in the top 5 to 10% of most deprived in the country. That's one way of telling the story. Another way of telling the story is to listen to local people's experience of the area. And certainly when I arrived 11 years ago, one of the stories that I heard again and again was that this was a place that was underinvested in. It was overlooked, it was ignored, people's voices weren't heard, Organisations came in when they had funding, promised the world, and then left promptly as soon as the funding ran out, normally 1 or 2 or at the most 3 years later. It was a place where people often felt done to, certainly rather than done with. And even over the years that I've been here, it's been a place where we've experienced quite a lot of asset stripping along the way. The age of austerity has meant that various council-run facilities, for example, have been closed and taken out of the neighbourhood. So that's one bit of the story. Another bit of the story, with my dog collar and my vicar's hat on, is about Hodghill Church. The building of St Philip and St James Hodghill was built in the 1960s in the posher bit of the parish at the top of Hodghill Common. In the 60s, it was a pioneering, cutting-edge bit of church architecture. It had loads of breakout rooms and flexible spaces. There was a badminton court laid out on the nave of the worship space itself. And it was a space that played host to lunch clubs and parents and toddler groups and sports clubs and all kinds of stuff, to the point that people would describe the building as a thriving heart of community. It was a place that was well used, a place that people came to for groups and activities every day of the week. Unfortunately, like a lot of 1960s church architecture, it was also a bit rubbish. It was built largely of concrete, it had lots of flat roofs, and by the early 2000s, there were all kinds of issues with the building itself, and the church congregation were facing a £500,000 repair bill. And one summer, a couple of years before I arrived here, some members of the church congregation went on holiday and came back a week later to find that their beloved building had been demolished. One of the ways that we tell some of our stories here, both of church and of wider neighbourhood, is to point to precipitating events, one of those crises that means that you kind of have no choice but to shift mode. In some communities, that might be a flood. For many of us, it might be a global pandemic, but certainly for Hodghill Church, it was the closure of the church building that meant a real shift of understanding of how we did church, what mission was, and how we engaged with our community. And certainly when I arrived in 2010, coinciding with the new Conservative government and the age of austerity being announced and beginning, the question from church members was, how do we do this? We don't know how to do church anymore. We don't know how to do mission anymore. We don't know how to engage our neighbours. And what we did, and it was pretty much instinctive rather than following any kind of theory or model, was we mapped our area. We identified where the bumping spaces were that people naturally gather together and encounter each other. And we went out and we listened. We were really clear as a majority middle class congregation in an area that would mostly identify as working class. We were really clear that our job was not to go out and do things to people, or even to go out and do things for people. Our role at that point was to go out with open hands, empty hands, and to listen. And so we listened to our neighbours, and we heard stories from folk locally who'd moved in when the houses were built, of a community that they loved and delighted in, but over the years they felt had gone downhill. We heard stories of folk who'd arrived much more recently as part of the quite radical demographic change in the area, from a majority white community to a community with many different nationalities and ethnicities that we live in today. We heard stories of being welcomed warmly. We heard stories of people who felt like this was just a place where they slept and they did most of their living and their shopping and their praying elsewhere. But more than anything, we heard stories of local people being good neighbours to each other. Christians, Muslims, pagans, people who wouldn't identify with any faith perspective, but people who we heard and saw demonstrating compassion, generosity, trust, friendship, and hope among their neighbours. We heard stories of the postmaster at the local post office who would know when someone was poorly and would find out where they lived or where they were in hospital and would take flowers to them. We heard stories of grandmas picking up their grandchildren from school and picking up loads of others as well and taking them to their house and looking after them until their parents were able to pick them up later. We had countless stories like these. And for us as a church, this was a spur for us to say, stuff is happening in this neighbourhood already. People are loving each other, caring for each other. Our role is to be present among those stories, to make friends, to nurture trust, and to celebrate what's happening. And so one of the early things we did was we hosted an event we called Hodghill Unsung Heroes, where we invited 97 local people who'd been nominated by their neighbours as unsung heroes in their community to come together and shared some of their stories. We asked people that evening, if you could find a couple of neighbours to join you, what would you start in your neighbourhoods? And we were able to offer a little bit of support and nurture to some of those ideas to help turn them into reality. But more than anything, we learned through those early bits of the journey that one of the things that we as church can do is to inhabit those bumping spaces and to intentionally hear people to speech, intentionally nurture spaces where voices can be heard, where gifts can be unearthed, where passions can be unleashed, and where people can find connections with each other so that they're able to share their passions, gifts, and skills with their neighbours. And for us as a church, that helped stir a vocation which has now become a long-term journey, but has also presented us with all kinds of gifts that we're able to receive and rejoice in along the way, and all kinds of ways in which we've been challenged and have had to learn and change too. So that's a bit of our story.
Brilliant. So hopefully you caught what I was saying there about Hodghill Church and their work on the Firs and Bromford estate. So just ask you to hold that question again in your mind that we asked you at the beginning. What feels different about the work that Al was describing compared to responses of poverty, such as a food bank? So we're going to go into breakout rooms now, and there should be 3 or 4 of you in each room, so a chance for you all to speak, but also to kind of introduce yourself to one another as well, and just reflect on that question. And you'll have about 10 minutes to do that. So Steve, are we able to put people in their first breakout room? We're back, everyone. We were just saying it's a good sign when people wait to come out of their breakout rooms. It hopefully means you're having a good conversation. So we hope those were good conversations and you start to get to know each other a little bit. You'll be back in those breakout rooms with the same people hopefully later on. So you don't have to reintroduce yourself, you can get straight to chatting. Lovely. So we are going to look at our reading for this evening now. And I'm going to ask for volunteers. Would anybody like to read the passage for us? We'll put it up on the screen so you don't have to have the text in front of you. But the passage is Romans 12, so it's not one with super long words from the Old Testament or something. Is there any takers to do some reading for us? Dennis, that's wonderful. Thank you so much for raising your hand.
Pleasure.
Brilliant. Can you see that all right on the screen?
I can yes, I can see that now. My glasses are on and that's okay.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dennis. Take it away.
Okay. So the reading's from Romans 12, 1 to 13. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers and sisters, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your minds, so that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. For by the grace given to me, I say to everyone among you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think, but to think with sober judgment, each according to the measure of faith that God has assigned. For as in one body we have many members, and not all the members have the same function, so we, who are many, are one body in Christ, and individually we are members of, my hand up has got in the way, one another. We have gifts that differ according to the grace given to us, in proportion to faith, ministry in ministering, the teacher in teaching, the exhorter in exhortation, the giver in generosity, the leader in diligence, the compassionate in cheerfulness. Let love be genuine. Hate what is evil. Hold fast to what is good. Love one another with mutual affection. Outdo one another in showing honour. Do not lag in zeal. Be ardent in spirit. Serve the Lord. Rejoice in hope. Be patient in suffering. Persevere in prayer. Contribute to the needs of the saints. Extend hospitality to strangers.
Thank you so much, Dennis. I feel like we've just seen one of your gifts there. That was a brilliant reading. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We're gonna now, Kerry and I are gonna have a conversation through some of our thoughts that came out from that passage that we've been reflecting on as we heard a little bit more about Alan Hodghill's work. That hopefully will kickstart a bigger conversation that you guys can pick up in your breakout rooms in a little bit. But Kerry, I wondered first, we want to share a quote from Penny, who's one of the members of Hodghill Church as well. Steve, I wonder if you could share that slide for us. And Kerry, perhaps you can share Penny's quote with us.
Sure, thanks, Hannah. So yeah, this was just a little quote that was in the briefing notes, which is from Penny, who is a local resident in Hodghill and also one of the street connectors. And I thought her reflection was a really good way to start off. She says, I sometimes ask myself, who do we share these good fruits with? It is easy to share fruits with family, friends, and kind neighbours, perhaps because it tends to be a two-way process. You do a kindness for a friend, and when able, they return with a kindness for you. And I wonder if we can be at risk of becoming restricted in who we share our fruits with. We might hand them out to our friends, but not notice those on the edges. God's kingdom is for everyone, so let's share these fruits with everyone. Let's notice and rejoice in the sharing of fruits in our neighbourhood and learn from those examples. Let's notice the newcomer, the stranger, the reserved person, the sidelined, and make sure they have the best of God's fruit as well. I don't know about you, Hannah, but I love that. I think we can stop sharing it now.
Yeah, I really like that. I like the challenge there that actually we can often really hold on to the things that we have either to share or that we've picked up from other people without knowing it. That sometimes it's more instinctive. We're not consciously thinking about restricting who we come into contact with or who we listen to or who we share our fruits with. But sometimes it can be subconscious or some of the things that become instinct, which is a really interesting thing that Penny's picked up on there.
Yeah.
So we've asked the question initially for people in breakout rooms, but Kerry, for you, what feels different for you about this kind of approach to poverty that we've been looking at in Hodghill?
I love hearing about the work Al does, and I think it's really important, isn't it, Hannah, to recognise that we know just how much we need food banks, we need our debt advice centres, we need our baby banks, we need all of the other incredible things that people do through opening up their church, using their resources and meeting the needs that are only sadly getting worse as we see poverty increase across the UK, and as we predict it, only increasing further. So I think when I reflect on this, I'm not thinking those other forms of reaching out, of recognising how we care for those in our community and share what we have are in any way bad. They're very much needed. They're part of what we share, part of who we're called to be. But for me, there's something about, I loved Al's little phrase about a different way of telling the story, this idea of going outside the walls of the church, going beyond with open hearts and listening and hearing stories. And just for me, there's so much in that, a reminder that we are called to gather and also to disperse as God's people. And that really kind of radical counterculture thing that we saw Jesus modeling in lots of the way that he engaged with people and the way that he listened to stories and the way that the people that were on the edges, their stories and experience were brought right into the middle. You think of the kind of parables Jesus told. So I think there's something really at the heart of the gospel around the way that Al acts. What about you, Hannah?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I think you're right in identifying that actually it's not a lack of need for some of the kind of really practical tools that we often do in church, often really involved within our communities. But for me, it feels less about a difference in action or activity, but more about a difference in posture. That actually what we're saying is by looking for people's gifts and skills and by opening up a space for them, is I really like that phrase that Al used about creating a space for those things to be shared. It's almost a posture of trust, in trusting that the situation before us can change. And actually, if we don't have that long-term view in mind, that long-term hope and trust that actually there is more underneath the surface than perhaps we're being presuming is there, then actually not much is going to change. We're going to keep on with that sticking plaster approach that we often do, that says actually we'll sustain perhaps some of the challenges that are before us, rather than really trusting that transformation is possible. And that is, like you picked up on there, Kerry, a really biblical approach, a really gospel-centered approach that remembers that God's promised a different world and actually acts as though it's true, and remembers that actually we're all part of that. It's not just the church that's part of that, but it's the whole community that's part of that transformation. So actually trust that if we look for that, we will find it in the communities around us. I think that's a big thing for me as well, is that that difference in saying, instead of saying I have something you need, let me give it to you, it's about saying we all have something to share, and that really levels the playing field, and it feels like a very different kind of approach.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and starting from that place of openness. When I was reflecting on this before the session, was struck by a phrase that I've heard and used before, particularly in relation to debt, where it talks about a spiral of asymmetry relationship. It feels like a very grand phrase, but the phrase points out that sometimes when our relationships are unbalanced, they can become more and more unbalanced as time goes on, that actually the power continues to shift and the gap between people continues to get bigger and bigger if actually we start on that unequal playing field. And so I think it's Rowan Williams who talks about it, that actually this spiral of asymmetry can just get bigger and bigger as we continue to what we think is often addressing need, and often that is the case when we start. But actually, if the power balance isn't level at the start, then actually we're in much bigger danger of that relationship gap getting wider and wider. Whereas actually this approach really puts relationship at the centre.
Yeah. And there's something, isn't there, about the way Al spoke about, people being ready to go out with open hearts, open hands, that actually giving up of power. So going out of our comfort zone into a place where we may feel that we're a little bit more daunted. I know the area a bit. I worked there for a couple of years, and I can imagine that for some people it is a bit daunting. This is a bit unsettling. You're essentially in a place where you're not known, and other people are kind of the folk in the community, that's their space. And so there's something really lovely about saying, yeah, I'm up for this. It really shifts. Sometimes we talk a lot about the guest host dynamic, don't we? And I think there's space and time to do both, but actually to open yourself out and say, we really want to come and be with you and recognize that God's already there. We're not bringing God out into the community. Actually, God's there in and working in and through people. I told those lovely examples, didn't he, of the person in the post office who takes out flowers, the people who care for others, all of those gifts and all of those beautiful examples that remind us that God's there at work in and amongst people already.
Yeah. And one of the phrases I was struck by that Al used when he was talking about those things is he said they saw lots of people being good neighbours to one another. And that often feels like a very Bible phrase, doesn't it? That we're called to be good neighbours to one another, to love our neighbour. But actually, sometimes we need that push to recognise we don't have a monopoly on, as people of faith, as Christians, we don't have a monopoly on being good neighbours to one another. That actually, if we look for it, other people are often doing it much better than we are, without even trying. And actually, we can, if we're open, we can learn a lot from seeing other people who do that, even when it doesn't necessarily come from that place of faith. And so I was really struck by that use of that phrase that he picked up on, that actually we're seeing examples of the people being good neighbours.
And to be seen doing that, I thought was lovely. I loved the example of having those unsung heroes, actually to have someone else see you and recognise you and recognise what it is that you're doing. You're not doing it for the thanks, so you're not ever expecting that recognition, but actually to have someone else see and celebrate that, that's such a powerful thing. And I think, just as you were saying earlier, Hannah, that kind of spiral of power, when you've perhaps been caught in that and experienced the stigma and the shame that we know that economic marginalisation brings for people, actually to have that readdressed by someone saying, I see you and I believe you're worth something and I believe you have gifts, that's a really powerful thing too, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's such power in recognising where, I was really struck by the way I was talking about things that have been done to the community by external factors. So when he talked about kind of the asset stripping and particularly the effects of austerity, we often don't take the time to think about what that says to a community. Actually, if you're a community who've been kind of bearing the brunt of external factors, things that have been done to you without your control, things that have been taken away from you, there's more than just the practical elements of that communicates something about value often for people, and that can become really deeply embedded in how people tell the story of their community. But actually, if we have the opportunity to open up and air some of those other stories, it can start to push back against that kind of predominant narrative that can often become quite embedded, where people have been done to a lot, and often by external factors, and often by kind of policies and practices from a structural sense, from a government sense, where actually that's abused the gifts that the communities have to offer. Actually, how can we be part of opening that up and giving them a chance to grow again? We've talked about this a little bit already, Kerry, but why do you think this approach resonates with us, particularly as people of faith?
I think there's something incredible, isn't there, about being able to, something really deeply incarnational about this, isn't there? I think, as I've said already, that sense that of often as church we think about the church as we know it could or should be, and then we also turn around and think, well, here is the church as it is, and there seems to be such a gap. And often I think where we get stuck is knowing, well, what can we do? We sort of know, lots of us, that there is this fragmentation and disconnect from our community, which is what we touched on the start. And I think this approach, this kind of humbly going out, open-handed, open-hearted, and saying, we just want to hear and listen and see where God is at work here, and recognise that the gifts that are here already is something which I think, as you've already said, Hannah, speaks into that hope, that deep belief that God is able to transform even where others may feel that there is no hope, that there's just despair. There's something really incarnational here.
Yeah.
What do you think, Hannah? What for you?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought about this before, but I was struck again by one of the phrases that I'll use about kind of having empty hands. And often that's something that that is a really humbling thing about coming before God as a Christian, that often we're struck by our own empty-handedness, aren't we? That actually we don't have anything to bring, but actually we receive so much from God. And if we're really honest about recognising God in the stranger, God in the other, God particularly on the margins, going empty-handed is a particular, perhaps, spiritual discipline or posture of being able to say, I'm prepared to encounter God here. I am empty-handed, and in that humility, recognising that we're much more likely to receive than we are necessarily able to give, which can be really powerful. I think part of me just wants to note as well that I don't think this is saying that it's not okay to bring the gifts and skills and the assets that we do have into those spaces, but actually sometimes those are really needed. And actually historically, churches have often been places where power is held, where resource is held. Whether that is the case practically in our own churches today, sometimes it doesn't feel like that. I know when we're churches are struggling to balance the books as well often. But if we do have something to bring, it's okay to offer that into that space, but to do it with that approach of humility as well.
We struggle to talk about power, don't we, Hannah? I know we've talked for long enough, but I often think we'd much rather talk about serving and service. But I think to pretend we don't have power isn't right either. Power is, but the power we have, we can give away, we can use for good, we can allow it to corrupt. And actually what we're centering on here isn't the kind of so much the money power, which is what's caused part of the issues here, where people have been economically marginalized through the decisions that they haven't been able to play a part in, but actually the church recognizing the power of relationships and the power of bringing community together and listening. There's something really, really radical there, and that I think we don't often as people of Christian faith fully recognize, just the power at the heart of what we believe good news to be, that relationship.
And we're going to put you guys in breakout rooms in a moment to have a think about this and discuss some of the things that are coming to the top of your mind. But Kerry, I just wondered, before we do that, when we planned this before, we wanted to end somewhere that felt accessible. Some of this stuff can feel really big and quite far away often from what we're familiar with, especially if we're used to some of these models of responding to poverty that are practical, that get us giving out and handing out resources, and that feels really doable. What are the ways in to responding in this way, Kerry? What are the kind of first steps that you see perhaps into kind of turning towards this approach?
I loved, I think, the way Al started, even though he said, he started without a strategy, it kind of just happened. I think actually what they were unknowingly doing is tapping into lots of practices that people who are into community organising, asset-based community development just do naturally. So actually find a few of you within your church community and find a way to, this sounds really obvious, but go for a walk. And the first time you do it, just notice what's happening around you. What are you seeing? Are there lots of people, lots of traffic? Are there empty spaces? Are there places? I loved Al's little phrase of kind of bumping spaces, the places where people meet up or gather that, are official or unofficial gathering spaces. Might be a cafe, might just be a particular corner where two streets meet. That's where everyone seems to stop and chat. Or a neighbour who's always out, at the front of their house and people chat there. What are you hearing? Is it busy, quiet conversation? What can you smell? Is it food cooking? Is it traffic fumes? What's your gut feeling as you go round? What are you feeling in your gut? And it's sometimes really lovely just to do that in pairs, see how you feel differently, go at different times of day of night, just kind of feel even a really familiar community. Doing that intentionally and prayerfully can really open our eyes to different things. And it's from that, Al said this beautifully, where are the places that you can just go and begin the conversations? Is there a cafe? Is there a hairdresser's? One of my colleagues, some of you might know Eunice Atwood, she nearly always finds a local hairdresser's to go to, and that's where she starts making community connections, which I've always thought is a brilliant idea. But you'll find your ways. Just starting to small and listening.
Thank you, Kerry. I think that's a really good place to start. So we're going to put you guys back in breakout rooms, if that's all right now, and for a chance to process some of this stuff together. We've got a couple of questions that hopefully might prompt that. So Steve, I wonder if you could just pop those up on the screen for us and we'll put them in the chat as well. So those are, Al challenges us to give attention to people's gifts and to sharing the fruits of the Spirit with everyone. Where are the opportunities for this in your neighbourhood? So we'd really just encourage you to call to mind the people around the neighbourhood you were thinking about when we were doing the reactions activity right at the beginning, to think about them as you do this activity. And the second question is, how does this change how we respond to poverty? And the big thing to note is that we'd love it if you could nominate one person from your group. We want to do this right at the beginning so you don't get caught out when you get jumped back into the main room at the end. Nominate one person to share some brief feedback when we're back in the room together. And then hopefully we can hear from everyone. So we'll pop those in the chat as well. But we'll send you into breakout rooms for about 15 minutes now, 10-15 minutes. You've got a little bit longer to chat about these ones as well.
It's so lovely to listen just to the breadth of group discussion, the depth, the different issues you've all had conversations about. I'm really sorry that our time together is almost over because we could keep talking. And I'm going to hand over to Hannah, who's got an idea for a couple of actions that you could do going forward. Hannah.
Yeah, thank you, Kerry. We don't quite have enough time to leave some space to do this now, but one of the things we wanted to suggest to you was kind of a next step action. So we wanted to suggest that you started off by just taking a moment to think about one phrase or sentence that you would use to summarize how you've experienced your community so far. So one phrase or sentence that just depicts what your experience has been of engaging with your community. And then to think of 3 people or groups you'd like to go and speak to find out how they've experienced your community. So people within the shared community that you could go and talk to. And our hope with that is that you'll have a record of where you started from. So often we don't take time to think about where we begin in these processes, so that after you've had those conversations, you might be able to come back and reflect on how other people's experiences have been different. But also how your own experience has been changed by getting to know theirs a little bit. So perhaps that's something you want to do this evening after we've come off the call, or you might take some time over the next few days to think about that. But we'd really encourage you to just do that as a first step, to write down your experience, and then to think about three people or groups you might want to talk to and to ask about theirs. We're coming really close to the end of our time together this evening, but we just wanted to share a couple of the places you can go for some next steps. And when Kerry and I were thinking of this, we suddenly realised that we didn't have to go far, and that actually some of the groups who are facilitating these sessions over Lent have some really valuable things to offer. So Kerry, I think you've got some links to share.
Yeah, so I've just popped in the chat a couple of links. I thought we'd better put the JPIT link in just in case for some reason you didn't have it, but there's also a link to some of the resources that are emerging around walking with Micah. So how to have conversations around justice in your church, how that helps you think about how you position yourselves on that, as Hannah said. There's also the link to Church Action on Poverty's website. And then finally, I've just popped in a link. Part of the evangelism and growth team's focus on new places for new people is for creating new church communities at the economic margins. So if you have not tapped into that, you might find that interesting. And Deacon Eunice Atwood and I are currently co-leading a few sessions on beginning a church at the margins that weaves in some of the asset-based community development practices and community organising practices that you've heard us speak about today. So please do check those out. So grateful to be with you this evening, and I'm going to hand over to Hannah for our closing prayer.
Yeah, so thank you so much all for joining us, and we've got one more session of these next week, of these Lent courses. But if there's anything that you'd like to follow up on, or you actually think there's a thought that occurs to you, a question you have after this, please do get in touch. The emails that you've had through Eventbrite when you've signed up, if you reply to those, they should come to the Joint Purpose Use team inbox, and we can pick those up and make sure that you're connected up with the right people if you'd like to explore more. So please do that. And we'll just take a moment of quiet before we pray. God, we want to thank you for your generosity with us this evening and throughout our lives. We thank you that you are generous in your graciousness to us, that you accompany us in our learning and our listening, but that you are also so generous in how we are blessed through encountering one another, through discovering that somebody has gifts and skills that we hadn't even anticipated, and through seeing you in the community around us. God, we pray that this evening would have stirred up something in our hearts and minds that would lead us closer to you and closer to the communities around us. Would you be with us, God, as we go from this gathered space this evening? Would we feel your presence alongside us? Would we return here next week, having seen you in unexpected ways? Amen. Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, everyone. Hopefully we'll see some of you next week as well.